The German army filed after-action reports throughout the autumn of 1944. Some of those reports examined captured American equipment, and in the catalog of objects pulled from disabled Sherman tanks recovered at Aachen, in the Hürtgen forest, and later in the snow outside Bastogne, the same item appears in entry after entry. A small armored box, welded to the rear deck of the tank just above the exhaust grille. Inside the box, 3 objects: a standard U.S. Army field telephone, the EE-8 model, standardized in 1938, the same Bakelite handset and crank magneto generator that civilians used in their own homes, a repurposed .30 caliber ammunition case, still bearing its faded yellow stencil, Cal .30 Ball M2, and 20 feet of communications wire, run through a drilled hole in the engine deck and spliced into the tank's internal intercom system. German signal officers understood every component. They had used near-identical telephones in their own training at Wunsdorf. They could explain the mechanism in a paragraph. What they could not explain, what no staff officer in the entire Wehrmacht ever satisfactorily explained in the surviving documents, was a single, simple question. Why did the Americans have this on every Sherman? And why did no German tank, in 6 years of war, have anything like it at all? Not the Tiger, not the Panther, not the Panzer IV, not the Stug III, nothing. This is not a story about American genius. The British had welded telephones onto their Churchill infantry tanks as early as 1941. The U.S. Marines had wired field phones onto Shermans during the Bougainville landings in November 1943. The answer is not who invented it. The answer is why one of the most studied, most disciplined, most theorized military organizations on Earth, the same Wehrmacht that wrote the doctrine of combined arms warfare and taught it to every army that came after, never welded a 1938 telephone to the back of a tank. That answer explains far more about why Germany lost the war than any battle on any map. 3,000 miles west of Aachen, 14 weeks earlier, the problem this telephone solved was claiming American lives at a rate First Army had never anticipated. The geography did the killing. Norman Bocage was not terrain. It was an industrial accident of agriculture. Centuries of small farmers had built earthen banks between their fields, planted hedges along the tops to mark the boundary, and walked the same paths generation after generation until those paths sank into hollow lanes 8 feet below the surrounding ground. By 1944, each small Norman field was a natural fortress, walls of compacted earth 15 feet high on all 4 sides, a single sunken road in, a single sunken road out, sight lines of 40 yards or less. Tanks could not push through the hedgerows, they had to climb over, and climbing over exposed the thin belly armor to anything waiting in the next field. Infantry could not see beyond the next hedge. Neither could the tanks supporting them, and the radios. The radios were a different problem entirely. The American Sherman of 1944 carried the SCR-508, a frequency-modulated radio set, mounted in the turret bustle, operating in the 20 to 27 megacycle band. The American rifleman carried the SCR-536, the handheld, handy-talkie that became the visual signature of the GI in 1,000 newsreels. The SCR-536 used amplitude modulation, different band, different waveform, different signal architecture entirely. The 2 radios could not talk to each other. They could not be made to talk to each other. Engineers had tried solutions. Every one had failed. They had handed the infantry handy-talkie into the tank, and the Sherman's electrical system, with its generator and ignition and the running tank radios, produced enough interference to drown the small AM set in pure static. They had given infantry company headquarters a spare tank radio, mounted on a wooden backboard with a battery pack, and the rig weighed 34 pounds, required a trained operator, and went silent every time the man carrying it dove into a foxhole. They had tried hand signals, and a hand signal requires a tank commander whose head is above the cupola, and a tank commander whose head is above the cupola in Norman Bocage is a man already marked by a German sniper at 40 feet. So the infantry shouted. The tank crews did not hear them. The tank crews fired at the wrong hedges, or fired at empty fields, or did not fire at all. The infantry watched their armored cousins miss everything they were screaming about, broke off, and pulled back to better cover, leaving the Shermans alone in the lanes. A Sherman alone in the Bocage was a Sherman about to be lost. By the third week of June 1944, the cost had a name in First Army casualty reports. The clerks called it Tank-Infantry separation losses. The men in the lanes called it something the clerks did not write down. In one such scene, repeated in variations across the American sector during the final week of June, a sergeant of the 30th Infantry Division spent 9 full minutes trying to warn the Sherman in front of him about a Panzer team in the hedge to the right. He threw rocks at the rear armor. He crawled forward and slapped the track guard with a rifle butt. He stood up, exposing his entire upper body, and waved both arms. The tank commander, sealed inside 2.5 inches of cast steel, neither saw nor heard any of it. The Panzer struck the lower hull plate at a 15-degree angle. The blast claimed the loader, the bow gunner, and the driver before any of them registered they were under attack. The commander survived, badly burned, pulled from the turret hatch by infantry he had not known were within 100 yards of him. 3 crew, 1 tank, 1 hedge. No way to talk. The 30th Infantry Division's after-action narratives that summer described the broken trust in plainer language than any field manual would dare to use. The riflemen had stopped believing the tanks could hear them. The tank crews had stopped believing the riflemen could guide them. 2 parallel battles in the same field. The 30th Infantry Division's attached armor support was the 743rd Tank Battalion. Commanding the 743rd was Colonel Duncan, a regular Army officer who had landed his battalion on Omaha Beach on D-Day and had watched it lose tanks every week to a problem no field manual described. In early July 1944, in a farmhouse cellar north of Saint-Lô, Colonel Duncan summoned one of his battalion staff officers. The officer's name was Captain Edward D. Miller. He was the Battalion S3, Operations. Before the war, he had been a Signal Corps soldier. He had spent the late 1930s in civilian life repairing telephones. Duncan placed the latest casualty report on the Cellar table. He set his finger on the number at the bottom of the page. He said one sentence, "Edward, by sunrise." What makes Captain Miller's overnight assignment historically remarkable is not the technical problem. The technical problem had been solved, twice, years earlier, by forces operating under the same Allied command structure as the 743rd Tank Battalion. 3,000 miles east, in Vauxhall Motors factory yards in Luton, Churchill infantry tanks had been rolling off the production line since June 1941. The Churchill was a specific kind of weapon, what the British classified as an infantry tank, designed not to race across the desert like a cruiser, but to crawl forward at the walking pace of a rifleman and break fixed defenses alongside foot soldiers. Tank-Infantry Doctrine, the British called it. Every Churchill, by mid-war, left the factory with an armored telephone box welded to the rear hull. Inside the box, a handset wired into the crew intercom. Outside the box, infantry. The wiring was permanent. The connection was rehearsed. The doctrine was written down. The later Comet cruiser, designed in 1943 and entering service in September 1944, carried the same fitting as standard equipment, a square box on the left rear engine deck, holding the infantry telephone and a first aid kit. The British tank design establishment had treated this as solved engineering for 3 years. The Americans, 3,000 miles further west, had also solved it, just not in Europe. In November 1943, on a coral island in the Solomon Sea called Bougainville, the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion put Shermans ashore at Cape Torokina. The Jungle 8 hand signals, the Jungle 8 radio. The Jungle 8 every form of tank infantry coordination that pre-war doctrine had specified. So the Marines welded ammunition cans onto the rear engine decks of their M4s, dropped EE-8 field telephones inside, and ran wire through drilled holes into the crew intercom. The 754th Tank Battalion's Bougainville report documented the modification by January 1944. The same fitting reappeared at Tarawa later that same month, where Shermans of the 2nd Marine Division carried infantry phones in canvas rear-mounted bags. By the time the 743rd Tank Battalion landed on Omaha Beach in June 1944, the solution had existed for at least 7 months in the U.S. Marine Corps and for at least 3 years in the British Army. Captain Miller did not know any of it. This is not a failure of one officer's reading list. This is something stranger and more revealing about how the Allied war machine actually transferred knowledge in 1944. The Pacific Theater and the European Theater operated as separate intelligence ecosystems. The Marine Corps and the Army shared a flag and almost nothing else. Not training schools, not procurement chains, not lessons learned bulletins, not personnel rotation. A modification welded onto a Sherman at Cape Torokina in November 1943 had no formal channel to reach the 743rd Tank Battalion 8 months later in Normandy. The British, similarly, were sharing combat data with American forces, but at the level of strategy and logistics, not at the level of which box gets welded where on a hull plate. The Churchill carried a factory-fitted phone. The Sherman did not. The two tanks fought in the same operational theater, sometimes in adjacent sectors, and no one inside SHAEF treated the discrepancy as an item worth a memo. The lesson of those 8 wasted months is the one Miller's overnight workshop was about to teach, in miniature. Knowledge does not travel through armies the way armies imagine it does. It travels through specific men, in specific rooms, who have specific freedom to act on what they see. A doctrine manual can codify a fix. A factory can mass-produce a fix. Neither one, on its own, can carry a fix from one battlefield to another if the human network in between is not built to move it. The Marines on Bougainville solved this problem because their tankers and their infantry officers slept in the same coral mud and ate from the same mess kits. The British solved it because their infantry tank doctrine had been written by men who treated tank-infantry coordination as the single most important question of armored warfare. The U.S. Army in Normandy, by July 1944, had still not solved it, because the chain of command between a sergeant in a sunken lane and the Ordnance Department in Detroit was, in practical terms, longer than the supply line across the Atlantic. So Colonel Duncan walked into that cellar north of Saint-Lô and gave Captain Miller until sunrise. And what happened in that cellar, between dusk and dawn, was not invention. It was the discovery, by one signal officer working alone, of an answer that had been sitting in plain sight on every Churchill tank in the British Army for the past 3 years. Captain Edward D. Miller walked back to his tent at 2200 hours on a Norman evening in early July 1944. The exact date was not recorded in any surviving war diary entry that has yet surfaced. What was recorded, in family accounts later corroborated by surviving members of the 743rd Tank Battalion, was what Miller had with him when he sat down at the folding table. One EE-8 field telephone, drawn from battalion communication stores, standardized in 1938, manufactured for the U.S. Signal Corps by Connecticut Telephone and Electrical, one of the 8 companies turning out 2,000 units a day in factories from Hartford to Chicago. One empty .30 caliber ammunition can, salvaged from a discarded ration pile. The lid still closed with a hinged clasp. The interior, when opened, was almost exactly the dimensions of a packed EE-8 handset and base. One coil of W130 assault wire, the lightest field wire in the U.S. Army inventory, 8.5 pounds per kilometer, with a talking range of about 5 miles. Miller measured off 20 feet. That was the longest length a man on foot could comfortably hold without snagging on the rear sprocket of a moving tank. One soldering iron, one length of flexible armored conduit, one crescent wrench. That is the entire parts list for the modification that would shortly appear in some form on more than half of the Shermans in First Army. Miller worked through the short Norman night. The technical questions he had to solve in the hours between dusk and dawn were not trivial, but neither were they revolutionary. He knew from his pre-war career that the EE-8 was a sound-powered, magneto-rung instrument that would talk directly into any standard intercom amplifier without an impedance match. The Sherman's interphone system ran through an RC-99 amplifier feeding the crew's H-16 headsets. Miller cut the conduit, drilled a quarter-inch hole through the engine deck plate at a point shielded from small arms fire by the turret bustle, ran the wire, and spliced it directly into the commander's headset feed. He tested the rig at 0300. A signal corporal stood at the rear of an immobilized Sherman parked behind the cellar. Miller, seated inside the turret with the H-16 against his ear, heard every word the corporal spoke into the EE-8. "Captain, this is Corporal Voss. If you can hear me, transmit anything." Miller pressed the intercom switch. "Loud and clear, Corporal. Good night." That was the first conversation in the history of the U.S. Army's European theater of operations between a man standing in a dirt and a man sealed inside a Sherman, conducted through a 1938 telephone in a salvaged ammunition box. At 0700, Miller carried the modified ammunition can to Colonel Duncan's command tent. He set it on the camp table next to the casualty report from the previous evening. The duty log entry that survives reads in full, "Captain Miller demonstrated TI phone fitting, approved for trial, SOPs to follow." What it does not record is what happened next, which the men of the 743rd would describe in their unit history half a century later. The Battalion S2, Captain Robert Spears, was dispatched the same morning to the 30th Infantry Division headquarters to brief Major General Leland Hobbs's staff. By that afternoon, the 743rd's maintenance section had begun welding ammunition cans onto the rear decks of every Sherman they could pull from the line, 3 at a time, in shifts, using salvaged armor plate from disabled tanks to reinforce the box against shell splinters. The wiring was crude. The boxes did not always sit straight. The soldering, in some cases, was done by men who had never soldered before they joined the Army. The first dozen installations were inconsistent. Some held, some failed under shock load. Maintenance crews adjusted on the second day, on the third day, on the fourth day. By the fifth day, every Sherman pulled from the 743rd's line carried the fitting as standard. Other battalions in 1st Army began arriving at the maintenance compound to ask what the new boxes were. Word moved laterally, sergeant to sergeant, mechanic to mechanic, battalion to battalion, without ever passing through a single corps-level memorandum. This is how innovation actually traveled in the U.S. Army in the summer of 1944, not through the chain of command, through the chain of welders. The first combat use of the new fitting that left a clear paper trail came roughly a week after Miller's overnight workshop. The location was a hedge-bordered field a few kilometers west of Saint-Lô. The unit was a platoon of the 743rd attached to a rifle company of the 30th Infantry Division. The platoon had run into a German MG-42 position dug into the corner of the next field. A heavy machine gun crewed by men of the 352nd Infantry Division, firing through a notch cut in the hedge at a sustained 1,200 rounds per minute. 2 riflemen had already gone down. The Sherman supporting the platoon was sitting 40 yards back, turret traversed at the wrong hedge, its commander unsure where the fire was coming from. A sergeant, name not preserved in the after-action narrative, identified only as Platoon Sergeant B Company, ran a zigzag through the cabbage to the rear of the tank. He reached the new ammunition can welded above the exhaust apron. He yanked the lid open. He pulled the handset to his ear. Inside the Sherman, the commander's headset clicked. The sergeant said 6 words. "Machine gun, right front, tree line." The turret traversed 8 degrees clockwise. The gunner laid the 75mm onto the hedge at the indicated bearing. The loader rammed an M48 high-explosive round into the breech. The shell left the barrel at 1,930 feet per second. The hedge, the notch, the gun, and the 4 men servicing it ceased to exist as a coherent military position. The rifle platoon advanced. The Sherman advanced with them. Neither one had to guess where the other was looking. 6 words, 30 seconds. 1 enemy strongpoint reduced to a smoking gap in a Norman hedge. This was not an isolated incident by mid-July. It was the new normal in every American sector where the modification had spread. The Sherman crews, who had spent 5 weeks fighting half-blind in a maze of green walls, suddenly had a second set of eyes, at ground level, behind the cover of the tank itself, speaking directly into the commander's headset in real time. The infantry, who had spent 5 weeks throwing rocks and waving rifles, finally had a way to be heard. The 743rd Tank Battalion's loss rate dropped measurably across the second half of July. So did the 30th Infantry Divisions. The connection between the two numbers was no coincidence, and no one inside either unit pretended that it was. 40 miles to the south, Operation Cobra was about to break the German line in half. The Shermans that poured through that breach carried the new fitting on roughly 3 out of 5 rear decks. No one had ordered them to. On July 25, 1944, at 0938 Greenwich Mean Time, approximately 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers crossed the Norman coast at 12,000 feet, opened their bay doors over a rectangle of farmland 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles deep, and released their loads onto the position held by the Panzer IV division. The bombardment lasted just over an hour. When it ended, the elite armored formation that General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein had commanded an hour earlier had ceased to exist as a coordinated fighting unit. Of approximately 45 armored vehicles operational at 0930, only 7 remained capable of movement at 1100. More than 1,000 men of Panzer IV had fallen in the impact zone alone, with hundreds more wounded and concussed beyond combat use. Bayerlein, surveying his shattered position from a farmhouse cellar, would later write, in one of 20 separate manuscripts he produced as a prisoner of war, that no operation in the history of warfare had approached this single morning in the magnitude of its planning, the logic of its execution, or the seamless collaboration of sea, air, and ground forces that delivered it. Through the gap that opening salvo carved into the German line, the U.S. First Army poured. The armored columns that crossed the line of departure at noon on July 25th were not the same columns that had landed on Omaha 6 weeks earlier. The vehicles looked similar, the cast hulls were the same, the 75mm guns were the same, but on the rear deck of roughly 3 out of every 5 Shermans, just above the exhaust apron, sat a small armored box that had not been there on D-Day. No Corps-level order had specified the fitting. No War Department procurement memo had authorized it. No factory in Detroit was producing it. Maintenance battalions were fabricating the boxes in the field, from salvaged armor plate cut off disabled tanks, in numbers limited only by how many welders a battalion could keep working at one time. The modification had spread, in 20 days, from one tank in the 743rd Battalion to a substantial fraction of all American armor in Normandy. It had spread the only way a field modification could spread in an army of 1.5 million men in 1944. Lateral, informal, sergeant to sergeant, mechanic to mechanic, battalion to battalion. A tank crew arriving at a maintenance compound for engine work would notice the new box on a neighboring Sherman. They would ask. The maintenance sergeant would explain. They would request the same fitting on their own tank. The fitting would be welded that night. The crew would take it back to their company, where other crews would ask about it. The cycle would repeat at the next compound, in the next battalion, in the next division. This is what the after-action analysts at the U.S. Army Center of Military History would, decades later, label bottom-up institutional adaptation. The men doing the welding called it something simpler. They called it good sense. The test of whether good sense had been welded onto enough tanks came 13 days after Cobra began. The location was a stretch of low ground in the western Norman department of Manche, 10 miles east of the small market town of Mortain. The German operation, ordered personally by Adolf Hitler over the objections of his field commanders, was codenamed Lüttich. Hitler had pulled 4 panzer divisions out of the line at Caen, the 2nd SS, the 116th, the 1st SS, and the 2nd, and concentrated them for a single thrust westward through Mortain to the Atlantic coast at Avranches, with the operational objective of cutting Patton's Third Army off from its supply line back to Cherbourg. The thrust began at 0030 hours on the morning of August 7, 1944, in heavy ground fog that grounded Allied tactical air support for the first 6 hours of the battle. Holding the ground in front of the German axis of advance was the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. Reinforcing them in armor was the 743rd Tank Battalion, the same 30th Division that had fought beside the 743rd in the Bocage in June, the same 743rd that Captain Miller had handed his first prototype phone fitting to in early July. On Hill 314, a chalky rise overlooking the eastern approaches to Mortain, 12 men from E Company, 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, found themselves cut off and surrounded by elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, before the morning was an hour old. They held the ridge for 6 full days, calling artillery fire directly onto their own position through a radio whose battery they conserved by transmitting only twice an hour. What the men of E Company could see from the crest of Hill 314, through the lifting fog, across the valley below them, was the entire German axis of advance. Panther tanks moving in column, half-tracks of Panzer Grenadier infantry, self-propelled assault guns, the full weight of a 4-division armored thrust. 2 miles behind them, in the village of La Baie Blanche, the 743rd's tanks fought a defensive action against the same advance. Visibility on the ground, at tank height, was nothing. The Panthers came at them through the fog. The Sherman saw the Panthers only when the Panthers fired. But on the rear of every Sherman in that defensive line, the new ammunition box now held a tested instrument, and behind every tank, dug into the ditches and tree lines and stone walls of the Norman countryside, sat the riflemen of the 30th Division, with line-of-sight observation the buttoned-up tank crews did not have. A bazooka team leader from the 120th Infantry, dug into a culvert 30 yards behind a Sherman of A Company, 743rd, watched a Panther emerge from the fog at a bearing of 220 from his position, range approximately 600 yards, hull down behind a low stone wall. He ran to the tank. He pulled the lid open. He spoke into the handset. "Panther, 220, 600, hull down, stone wall." The Sherman's turret traversed. The 75mm gun, loaded with a 76mm M62 armor-piercing capped round of the type the 743rd had been husbanding in small numbers since landing, fired once. The round struck the Panther on the right side of the hull, 8 inches above the track guard, at a near 0-degree angle of impact. It penetrated the 60mm side armor and detonated inside the fighting compartment. The Panther burned where it stopped. This was repeated, in variations, along the entire 30th Division front for 6 days. Tanks that the Shermans could not see were spotted by infantry the tanks could not see either, and called in by voice through the phone fitting, and silenced one by one. The German thrust toward Avranches stalled at Mortain on the 3rd day. By August 13th, it had been thrown back to its starting line with the loss of approximately 150 armored vehicles. Hitler's last serious counteroffensive in the west had been broken in the green country between Mortain and Avranches. Among the many reasons it failed, one was a 1938 telephone in a salvaged ammunition box, welded to the back of a Sherman by a maintenance sergeant, whose name no one wrote down. To understand why no German tank in 6 years of war carried a phone on its back, you have to begin with one document. It was numbered Heeresdruckvorschriften 299/4A, issued by the German Army on May 25, 1942. Title: Training and Employment of the Rifle Company. It became, 6 weeks later, the doctrinal foundation for the formation officially renamed Panzergrenadier, Armored Infantry. The manual specified, with the precision the German General Staff was famous for, how the Panzergrenadier was to coordinate with the tank. He was not to coordinate alongside it. He was to fight from inside an armored half-track riding next to it. The SDK-FZ-251, the medium half-track produced at Hanomag since 1939. Same radio net as the tanks. Same speed, same fight. The infantrymen dismounted only on top of the objective. In theory, this eliminated the entire problem the Americans were solving with a salvaged ammunition can. The theory had a problem. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was not the Wehrmacht of 1940. The actual mechanization rate of the German army in 1944, the proportion of infantry riding in any armored vehicle whatever, was roughly 14%. SDK-FZ-251 production peaked at about 1,200 units a month. The Germans needed 4 times that figure to equip their existing Panzergrenadier formations to doctrinal standard. They never got there. They never came close. So what actually happened in Normandy when Panzergrenadier battalions had to keep pace with their tanks across terrain that ate trucks and motorcycles and marching infantry alike, was a compromise the doctrine manuals did not describe. The Panzergrenadier climbed onto the rear engine decks of the tanks themselves and rode there. In July 1944, Battalion Philips, the 1st Battalion of Panzergrenadier Lehr Regiment 901, moved through the small Norman town of Wehr under American pressure. The riflemen of Battalion Philips rode in sitting on top of Panther tanks, 16 men per tank, exposed to every shell splinter the road could deliver. This is the photographic negative of what the Americans were doing 40 miles to the north. The Americans had infantry on the ground, behind cover, talking to the buttoned-up tank crew through a wire that ran through a drilled hole in the engine deck. The Germans had infantry on top of the tank, in the open, with no way to talk to the crew sealed beneath them, except by banging on the hatch with a rifle butt. When the first American shells fell on the column entering Wehr, the Panzergrenadier of Battalion Philips fell first. They fell before the tank crews, sealed inside, even knew they were under fire. In early October 1944, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division entered the outer suburbs of Aachen, the first German city of the war to be assaulted on its own soil. Among the equipment the Germans recovered during that fight was a damaged Sherman of the 745th Tank Battalion, immobilized by a Panzerfaust strike, but otherwise intact. A German team towed it back to a workshop in the industrial quarter for evaluation. A captain of WWII 6, the Wehrmacht's branch responsible for evaluating captured Allied armor, climbed onto the rear deck of that Sherman and opened the small armored box welded above the exhaust apron. He identified the object inside, a standard U.S. Signal Corps EE-8 field telephone, standardized in 1938, wired through the engine deck into the crew intercom. He noted the modification in his evaluation report. He described it as einfach und wirkungsvoll, simple and effective. Then the report did something unusual for a German technical evaluation document. It stopped. No proposed adoption, no recommended countermeasure, no specification for a German equivalent. The captain wrote a description and walked away from the question. What he could not bring himself to write, what no officer in the German tank intelligence apparatus ever put in writing in any document that is surfaced from the captured Wehrmacht archives, was the question every man in that workshop must have been turning over while they looked at the handset inside. Why didn't we think of this? The question that German captain could not bring himself to write down has a specific answer. The answer is not that the Germans were stupid. They were, technically and intellectually, among the most sophisticated soldiers in the history of warfare. The answer is not that they lacked the parts. The Reichspost was running standard field telephones across occupied Europe in numbers that dwarfed anything Detroit produced. The answer is not that they lacked the welders. German industrial workshops were welding new turrets onto captured French tank chassis as late as 1944. The answer is something harder. In the German Army of 1942, 1943, and 1944, the chain of command between a sergeant who saw a problem and an engineer who could approve a fix ran upward through a structure that treated initiative below the rank of major as a category error. Modifications to standard equipment required authorization. Authorization required documentation. Documentation required a signature from a level of the general staff so far removed from the Bocage that the man signing had never set foot in a tank in his life. A field welder in a German Panzer regiment could not, by the structure of his army, do what Captain Miller's maintenance section did in 5 days in Normandy. In the U.S. Army of 1944, the same chain ran in both directions. An idea could move up through the formal channels, slowly, with paperwork, with delay, or it could move sideways at the speed of one sergeant walking across a maintenance compound and saying to another sergeant, "Here, look at this." The Americans built a war machine that worked because both channels existed. The Germans built a war machine that worked, in 1940, because the formal channel was unusually competent. By 1944, when the formal channel could no longer keep up with the rate at which the battlefield was changing, the second channel, the lateral one, the "here, look at this" channel, did not exist for them to fall back on. A war is not won by who has the best tanks. A war is, at some level no manual will write down, one by which army a corporal can show his idea to. The German army had answers in their manuals to questions the Americans were still figuring out in welding shops, and by the autumn of 1944, The answers in the manuals no longer matched the questions the war was actually asking. The U.S. Army's M1 Abrams main battle tank entered service in 1980. For the first time since the Sherman, an American tank rolled off the production line without an external infantry telephone. That decision lasted 26 years. By 2006, the M1A2 SEP variant, fighting in Iraq, in Fallujah, in Ramadi, in environments where the AGT-1500 gas turbine engine roared too loud for any infantryman to make himself heard at the rear of the tank, was being retrofitted, in the field, with an infantry phone in a small armored box welded above the rear deck. Inside the box, a handset, a cord, a wire running through a drilled hole into the crew intercom. The same logic, 8 decades on, the same problem, the same solution. The men of the 743rd Tank Battalion who came home in 1945 to small towns across America did not think of themselves as having done anything extraordinary. They had built something out of a 1938 telephone and an empty ammunition box, because the alternative was watching men die for no reason in a Norman hedge. They were not engineers. They were not innovators. They were simply soldiers who saw a problem they could fix between dusk and dawn, in an army that let them fix it. That was the difference. That was always the difference. If you found this story worth your time, take a moment to subscribe. The history we cover here is built from primary documents, from veteran testimonies, from records that took decades to surface. Your support keeps these stories alive for the next generation. We read every comment. If your family carries a piece of this war, share it below. Thank you for watching.